stimulus packages that simply haven't met the objectives that have been claimed for them.
All right, now do you think we're in the position where the government will be able to deliver on its election promises?
Well, look, it's a matter for the government to work out what it's going to do about its election promises, but it has got to stop treating the budget like a magic pudding. It has got to get on top of spiralling debt. We know now that the government has committed to $200 billion, possibly $300 billion of debt going forward. Now, this is unsustainable in the longer term, and the budget has to have a plan to bring it back into balance and to pay off debt. There is no plan to pay off debt.
Do you think that can happen while we're in the midst of this very crushing global downturn, and it is set to get worse for the rest of this year and probably next year too? Can you start paying off debt?
Well, you certainly have to stop the spiralling debt. You really can't just continue to spend and spend and spend. There are limits to how much debt is justifiable in circumstances, even in the global financial crisis. Now, we need to have a plan to pay off debt, and what we would do, of course, is to come forward with a plan whereby we can get on top of this spiralling debt. We're a party that actually takes the tough decisions and comes up with the plans to actually bring us back into balanced budgets and a sustainable economic situation.
But with respect, you did that in a time of very good times. The boom was happening in the mid-90s when you started on that program. But look, I just want to come back to this budget. Now, Labor's tax cuts policy at the last election essentially mirrored yours. Do you still support tax cuts to be delivered this year?
Well, what we've in fact said is that we think part of the general stimulus that we would have preferred would have been to bring forward the tax cuts, because we think that incremental tax cuts actually does a lot more to stimulate the economy than one-off poorly thought out cash splashes, some of which goes to people overseas who aren't going to stimulate the economy. You need to look carefully at how you how you stimulate going forward, and the tax cuts, we think, is a very important component not only of the stimulus on the consumer side, but also a whole lot of policies to help on the productive side of the economy.
So do you think the tax cuts then, which become more permanent imposts on the budget and therefore deficits and debt, are perfectly okay?
Well, look, decisions have to be made about what ultimate shape the budget is in, but we have said that these tax cuts have an important role and a critical role in the stimulus side of the economy. That was what we would have preferred, rather than one-off splashes that haven't in fact saved one job that the government can point to.
One of the biggest areas in the tax cuts that are due to come in this July will go to those earning over $180,000. Do you still support that?
Well, look, that's the way in which the tax cuts have been designed. They were provided for. But you are supporting
tax cuts. In fact, you want them to be brought in
earlier. They were provided for in the budget, and we think that it is appropriate that the tax cuts be brought forward, not that they be eliminated.
Okay, what about the education revolution? Do you think Mr Rudd is going to be able to deliver on that?
Well, look, that seemed to be a very poorly thought out policy. I mean, just take the computers in schools. That's an absolute, we always said that that was an absolute basket case of a policy, because unless you've got a much more better thought out structure to actually put computers in, to get them connected, to deliver them, it's not going to work. So if you just take that component of the so-called computer revolution, it hasn't worked so far, and unless there'd been a top-up from COAG, it wouldn't have worked at all. So how they're going to actually structure that in the budget is going to be very diverting to see.
The increase in the single age pension, now that was much talked about many months ago, before perhaps the severity of the downturn was really understood properly or grasped by the government or economists. Now, do you think it looked rock solid then? Should it be delivered in full now?
Well, of course, we were very much committed to looking at an increase in the pensions. We thought that that was an area that had been critically neglected in the last budget. we in fact raised the issue of pensions and dragged the government kicking and screaming to make some provision for pensioners, and we have supported the fact that that should be provided for in the budget. Now, the government has in fact said that that will be in the budget, and of course that's something that we have supported.
Okay, we do also know that it will be a tough budget. There will be some cuts we're being warned about, but if unemployment gets worse, and it looks like it's going to get to 8% or worse than that, won't a lot more people who lose their jobs need support and help from the government?
Well, look, we think that the test for this budget, for example, will be what it does about unemployment. It is absolutely critical that people who have lost their jobs or people who are leaving school and have a prospect of a job. So we certainly think that that will be one test of the budget. Another will be to come up with a plan to actually get the budget back into some sort of balance, because it's clearly not in balance. And thirdly, to stop spiralling debt and to work out a way whereby we can start paying off debt. Now, so far, we've seen absolutely no plan to do any of those three things, and we think that that will be a critical test of this budget, and we'll certainly await with interest to see what the government's going to do. We would certainly address those three areas as the coalition.
Okay, I want to ask about the issue of the Rio Tinto's alliance with Chinalco. Do you support your federal leader, Malcolm Turnbull, who's urging the federal government to reject it?
Oh, look, absolutely. I think that clearly, while it's the test is in the broader public interest, I think Malcolm Turnbull has identified effectively and early on the fact that there are some very significant interests, Australia's significant interests, that would be affected if this deal were to go ahead, and some fundamental conflicts of interest that would be borne out if this in fact was actually approved by the Treasurer. We have to remember, of course, that this is very much the Treasurer's decision. It's not something, for example, that will be subject to a debate, and we think that it is important that we flag our position up front.
All right, well, let me ask you a bit more specifically about that position. Chinalco would only be lifting its stake to 18%. It only gets 2 board seats. That doesn't give it control over these precious Australian mines, Australian assets. How is that against the national interest?
Well, look, I'm not going to be going into all the details about information that might be available to the Treasurer, but if you just look at it in a broad sense, which is what the test is, in the broader national interest, I mean, clearly you've got a situation where there can be influence, and you've got also no real way of enforcing undertakings that are often required as part of these particular arrangements for investment in Australian resources.
So you're worried they might go back on their word if they
I haven't actually said that, but I think the structure of such an arrangement would be very difficult to enforce.
All right, so just briefly, you don't accept Rio's own assessment that jobs will go if this link-up doesn't happen, also reiterated by the Queensland Premier Anna Bligh and your Liberal colleagues in WA.
Well, look, I think that the position with jobs is very important, but there are occasions when the national interest has to be balanced as against something as critical as jobs. I think that's what Malcolm Turnbull has done very effectively, and I think it is very important that the public know that we do stand for the national interest the way we see it, and the national interest the way we see it is that this kind of investment by a state-owned or influenced organisation would not be in Australia's interest with such a vital, non-renewable resource.
Helen Coonan, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Helen.
Helen Coonan speaking to us there. Coming up next, is Pakistan becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda? That's after this short break.